My wife and her mom left my son behind and paid a heavy price. You won't believe how it all started. One moment, I was about to board the plane with my family. The next, my wife and her mother had left my son behind, completely abandoned him. But that's not even the worst part. What I did after that, well, let's just say it changed everything. Stick around, because you're not going to want to miss what happened next. The airport hummed with activity, a sprawling web of sound and motion. The roll of suitcases over linoleum floors, the faint blare of overhead announcements, and the low murmur of hurried conversations, all blended into a symphony of anticipation. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and roasted coffee, and through the enormous glass windows, planes taxied to and from their gates like great metallic birds, their wings gleaming under the sun. It should have been an exciting moment, one of those rare occasions where everyone's on the same page, looking forward to the same goal. Instead, there was a tension in the air around me that I couldn't ignore, a tension that had been building for weeks, even months, and now seemed to weigh down each step I took. My son, Max, was practically bouncing with excitement. He was clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur in one hand and a Disney World guidebook in the other, his bright brown eyes sparkling every time he glanced out the window at the airplanes. He was 8 years old and full of energy, a bundle of pure, unfiltered joy. "Dad, that one's huge," he exclaimed, pointing at a jumbo jet preparing for departure. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I found myself smiling, even though my stomach was tied in knots. "It sure is, buddy," I replied, squeezing his hand. "We'll be on one of those soon." At least, that's what I thought. Daphne walked beside me, her expression distant and her phone seemingly glued to her hand. She had that look I'd come to recognize all too well, the one where her lips curled into a faint, smug smile. The one that said she was aware of something I wasn't. Her fingers flew across her phone screen, sending messages I didn't have to see to know weren't about me. She hardly looked up, and when she did, her gaze barely lingered on Max. That spark she used to have when looking at him, the pride, the warmth that had been gone for a long time. Next to her was Sylvia, Daphne's mother. Sylvia always had a way of commanding attention without saying much. Her posture was rigid, her gaze sharp, like she was constantly judging the world and finding it wanting. She had been a dominating presence from the day I married Daphne, always managing to make her opinions known in the most cutting, understated ways. And right now, she was glancing at me as if I were the one out of place here, not them. I couldn't shake the sense that they were in on something I hadn't been told. It wasn't just the distant behavior, or the way they'd exchanged those brief, knowing glances. It was a feeling, a gnawing unease that had been with me since we'd started planning this trip. As we approached the check-in counter, I tried to shove those thoughts aside. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a vacation we could look back on as the moment we put things back together. Daphne and I hadn't been in a good place for a while, and though I'd stopped believing in miracles, part of me hoped that a week at Disney, surrounded by laughter and magic, might at least make things bearable. But as we reached the counter and I handed over our tickets, something was off. The woman behind the desk scanned the passports and frowned. "Sir, one don't see a ticket here for your son." Her voice was polite, but the words hit like a slap. "There must be some mistake," I said quickly, my pulse quickening. I confirmed everything twice. She checked again, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, but he's not on the booking." I turned to Daphne, half expecting her to step in, to say something, anything to clear this up. Instead, she just looked at me, that small smile curling her lips, and shrugged. "Oh, we thought it would be better if Max stayed behind this time," she said, her tone light, as if she were discussing the weather. My heart stopped. "What?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Sylvia chimed in then, her voice smooth as silk but sharp enough to cut. "Too many people, you see. Someone had to sit this one out." She said it as if it were obvious, as if I'd been in on the decision all along. Max, still clutching his dinosaur, looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. "Dad, why don't they want me to come?" he asked, his voice trembling. I felt the floor drop out from under me. How could I explain this to him? How could I make him understand something I couldn't understand myself? I knelt down, my chest tight with anger, confusion, and a hurt so deep it felt like it was crushing me. You didn't do anything wrong, Max, I said, my voice thick. This isn't about you. I wanted to yell. I wanted to scream at Daphne, at Sylvia, at anyone who could explain why the woman who was supposed to love our son would laugh at his pain, at mine. Instead, I stood, clenched my fists, and stared at Daphne, willing her to look me in the eye. She didn't. She just linked arms with Sylvia and turned away. My heart pounded as I realized what I had to do. I couldn't let them dictate this. I couldn't let them tell me Max didn't matter. I reached down, took his hand, and began to walk away. My voice was calm, though my insides were boiling. Come on, Max, we're going home. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could hear Daphne's soft laughter behind me, hear Sylvia's dismissive chuckle. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd broken me. But with every step I took, my resolve grew stronger. They had no idea what was coming. I didn't stop walking until we were outside, standing in the biting winter air, with Max clinging to my hand like it was the only thing keeping him steady. The glass doors behind us slid shut, cutting off the din of the airport, Sylvia's condescending voice, Daphne's laughter, and leaving only the sharp hiss of passing cars, and the occasional muffled announcement from inside. My breath rose in visible puffs, a harsh reminder of how cold it really was, but I barely noticed. My mind was still spinning. I could feel Max's small hand trembling in mine, his stuffed dinosaur hanging limply from his other arm. He was confused, hurt, looking up at me for an explanation I didn't know how to give. Why don't they want me to come, Dad? He asked again, his voice so soft, so broken, it felt like a punch to my gut. He was only 8, too young to understand the kind of betrayal we'd just been handed, too young to comprehend that his own mother and grandmother had decided, without a second thought, that he was expendable. I crouched down so I could meet his eyes, though I wasn't sure I could keep my own from showing just how angry, no, furious I was. Max, I began, my voice rough, this isn't about you. This is about them. And I promise you, I will never let them make you feel like you're not good enough. Do you hear me? You're everything, buddy, everything. I pulled him into a hug, holding him close as if my arms could somehow shield him from all the pain, all the confusion that was bubbling up inside him. For a moment, we stayed like that, just the two of us in the cold, the world moving on around us. I could hear the sound of a plane taking off in the distance, the faint hum growing louder, then fading into the sky. It was surreal, standing there with Max, knowing that Daphne and Sylvia were probably already making their way through security, their perfect little vacation plans undisturbed. They'd written him off so casually, so cruelly, that I couldn't wrap my head around it. How do you look at your own child and decide he's not worth the trouble? How do you laugh, actually laugh, as he stands there heartbroken? My jaw tightened as I stood back up, taking Max's hand again. Come on, kiddo. Let's get out of here. He nodded, his eyes wide, and I led him toward the parking garage where my car was waiting. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what just happened was sinking in deeper and deeper. I tried to keep my thoughts focused on the next move, get to the car, get home, figure things out, but the anger, the betrayal, kept clawing at me. Every time I thought about Daphne's smirk, Sylvia's smug tone, it was like lighting a match inside my chest. By the time we reached the car, Max seemed calmer, but I could tell he was still processing. He climbed into the back seat, clutching his dinosaur, and I made sure he was buckled in before getting behind the wheel. As the engine roared to life, I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It's going to be okay, Max, I said, more for myself than for him. We're going to figure this out. The drive home was quiet. Max stared out the window, watching the city blur past, while I tried to keep my mind from spiraling. I kept going over what I could have done differently, what I could have said or done to stop them. But no matter how many ways I sliced it, I came to the same conclusion. There was nothing I could have done. They'd made up their minds long before we reached that check-in counter. This wasn't some last-minute decision. It was deliberate, calculated, and that realization made my blood boil all over again. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the car, sitting there for a moment longer than I needed to. Max had already unbuckled his seatbelt and was waiting for me to open the door. "We're home, buddy," I said, forcing a smile as I stepped out and opened his door. He climbed out, still holding his dinosaur, and together we walked into the house. It felt emptier than usual. Colder somehow, even though the heat was on. The decorations for Christmas were still up, the tree twinkling in the corner of the living room. But the holiday cheer that had filled this house only days ago was nowhere to be found. Max wandered over to the couch and sat down, hugging his knees to his chest. I wanted to say something to comfort him, to make him feel better, but every word I came up with sounded hollow. Instead, I sat down beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Max," I said softly, "I know today didn't go the way we thought it would. But I promise you, we're going to have fun, okay? Just the two of us. We don't need anyone else." He looked up at me, his eyes still uncertain, but he nodded slowly. "Okay, Dad." It was a small victory, but it was something. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my mind already racing with plans. If they thought they could just leave Max behind like that, if they thought they could hurt him and get away with it, they had another thing coming. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let them ruin him. I would do whatever it took to show Max that he was loved, that he was enough, and that we didn't need them. I opened the fridge, staring blankly at the shelves. My appetite was gone, replaced by the churning anger and sadness that wouldn't let up. I grabbed a soda and took a long drink, trying to calm the storm inside me. I knew I had to keep it together for Max's sake. He needed me now more than ever. And that meant I couldn't let this consume me. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I made Max his favorite dinner, mac and cheese, with cut-up hot dogs, hoping it would cheer him up. We watched his favorite movie, though I couldn't tell you what happened in it. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene at the airport over and over. By the time I tucked Max into bed, he seemed more relaxed, his little face finally free of the hurt that had been etched into it all afternoon. But I couldn't sleep. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled in a web of anger, confusion, and determination. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with flashes of Daphne's face, Sylvia's mocking smile, Max's confused eyes. I woke up with a start, my chest tight, my hands clenched into fists. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the furnace kicking on. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet wash over me. I'd spent so long trying to hold everything together, trying to make our family work. I'd endured years of Daphne's coldness, Sylvia's judgment, because I believed that's what it took to be a good husband, a good father. I thought if I just tried harder, if I just held on a little longer, things would get better. But they didn't, they only got worse. And now, after everything, I realized I'd been fighting for something that was never real. The truth was, Daphne and Sylvia didn't care about me. They didn't care about Max. They cared about control, about appearances, about themselves. And I'd been too blind, too hopeful, to see it. But not anymore. They had shown their true colors, and now it was my turn to act. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the dark street. It was time to take back control. To show Max that we could be a family, just the two of us, without the toxicity, the manipulation, the lies. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never let them hurt him again. I turned away from the window and headed back to bed. I needed rest. Tomorrow was a new day. A day to start building something better. Something real. And no matter what Daphne or Sylvia tried to throw at us, I'd be ready. I'd protect Max with everything I had. Because that's what a father does. That's what love does. And they'd never take that away from us. Things were just starting to unravel. Imagine being betrayed like that, with no warning. What would you do in my situation? Comment 1 if you'd stand and fight. Comment 2 if you'd walk away. I'll show you what I decided, and believe me, it's nothing you'd expect. The drive away from the house was long and silent, but it gave me time to think. With Max in the back seat, fast asleep against the window, his dinosaur tucked under his arm, I had the space I needed to take it all in. I kept the radio low, more for the hum of background noise than for the music, as I gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. My thoughts raced, bouncing between anger and determination. There was no way I was going to let them treat him like that, and get away with it. Daphne and Sylvia might have thought they had the upper hand, might have convinced themselves that I was just going to roll over and accept it. They were wrong. I would show them that I wasn't the same man they thought they knew. The dark stretch of highway was barely lit, the occasional green exit sign flashing past as I sped on. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't just stay put. It felt like the walls of our old life were closing in. Even with Daphne and Sylvia out of sight, their actions hung over us like a shadow. I needed to get Max somewhere safe, somewhere far enough away that their poisonous words couldn't reach us. The night air was cold, and the heater in the car struggled to keep up. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Max's small figure. His breathing was steady, his face relaxed in sleep. He didn't deserve any of this. None of it. I clenched my jaw, my mind replaying the scene at the airport over and over. Sylvia's smirk, Daphne's casual indifference, their complete disregard for how they'd made Max feel it all fueled a fire inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't just about my pride or my frustration with Daphne's coldness. This was about protecting my son. By the time the first streaks of dawn appeared on the horizon, I decided to head south. I knew we needed a change of scenery, a place where Max could start fresh. Florida came to mind not for Disney this time, but for the quiet beaches and warm air. Somewhere Max could feel the sun on his face, see the ocean, and start to forget the way his mother and grandmother had looked right through him like he didn't exist. I pulled into a gas station somewhere in Georgia, the sky a pale gray, as the morning light began to spread. Max stirred as I stopped the car, rubbing his eyes and clutching his dinosaur closer. "Dad?" he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. I turned to him, giving a small smile. "Hey, buddy. We're just stopping for gas. Do you want to stretch your legs for a minute?" He nodded, his messy hair sticking up at odd angles, and climbed out of the car. I watched him walk over to a small patch of grass by the station, stretching his arms wide. He looked so small out there, so vulnerable, but he also looked happy, relieved. Maybe. To be moving. I knew he didn't understand everything that had happened, and I wasn't sure how to explain it all to him. How could I tell him that the people who were supposed to love him the most had turned their backs on him? I had to focus on what came next, on making sure he never felt that kind of hurt again. The gas pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full, and I replaced the nozzle, tightening the cap. I reached into my pocket for my wallet and paid at the pump before walking over to Max. He was crouched down, examining a small line of ants making their way through the grass. "What are they doing, Dad?" he asked, looking up at me with wide, curious eyes. "They're working together," I said, kneeling beside him. "See how they're all moving in the same direction? They're probably taking food back to their home." Max watched them for a moment longer, before standing up and brushing off his knees. "Can we get breakfast soon?" I nodded, ruffling his hair. "Yeah, let's find somewhere to eat." Back on the road, we stopped at a small diner off the highway. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, with worn vinyl booths and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. The waitress, a cheerful woman in her 60s, brought Max a tall glass of orange juice and set down a stack of pancakes in front of him. I sipped my coffee, watching him eat, feeling a flicker of hope that things might start to feel normal again. "Dad," Max said between bites, "when are we going home?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and I set my mug down carefully. I looked into his eyes, trying to find the right words. "I don't think we're going back there for a while, buddy," I said gently. "Right now, we're going to keep moving forward. Just you and me." He tilted his head, his fork paused in midair. "Why not?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Because we need to find a place that feels safe. A place where we can be happy without worrying about anything else." Max seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said, going back to his pancakes. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. I could see that he trusted me, that he believed I would keep my promise to protect him. That trust was everything. As long as I had that, I could keep going. By the time we reached the Florida state line, the sun was high in the sky, the temperature warm enough to roll down the windows. Max leaned out slightly, letting the wind ruffle his hair, his laughter bubbling up as he spotted a billboard with a cartoon alligator. It felt good to hear him laugh again, to see him excited about something as simple as the wind in his hair and a silly sign on the side of the road. We made our way to a small coastal town, the kind of place that wasn't too crowded but still had enough life to feel welcoming. I found a modest motel near the beach, just a few minutes walk from the water. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and quiet, and that was all I needed. Max was already itching to get his feet in the sand, and after we checked in, we headed straight for the beach. The salty air hit me as soon as we stepped onto the shore, and I watched as Max ran ahead, his shoes in one hand, and his dinosaur in the other. He laughed as the waves lapped at his toes, and I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on my chest eased just a little. I stayed close, keeping an eye on him as he splashed in the shallow surf. The sun was warm on my face, the rhythmic sound of the waves soothing. This was what I wanted for him to feel free, to feel happy. I still didn't know exactly how we'd move forward, but in that moment, watching Max laugh and play, I knew I'd made the right choice. I knew I'd keep fighting for him, no matter what. The days in Florida passed in a blur, each one blending into the next, but in a way, that was exactly what I needed. I woke up every morning with the sound of the waves rolling in, and the sunlight streaming through the blinds. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Max adjusted quickly, much quicker than I'd expected. He woke up excited, bouncing out of bed with his stuffed dinosaur in hand, ready to run down to the beach. The moment we'd finished breakfast, the change in him was noticeable, even though he didn't say much about what had happened back at the airport. He'd stopped asking questions at least, the kind of questions that sent my stomach into knots, and had settled into this new routine like it was perfectly normal. For him, I think the beach, the waves, and the warm sand were enough. They gave him something to focus on, something to look forward to. For me, it wasn't that simple. I'd sit on the balcony after Max fell asleep each night, looking out at the dark expanse of ocean, the rhythmic crash of the waves, both calming and maddening. I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to everything that had led us here. I replayed every conversation, every argument, every moment when Daphne and Sylvia had made it clear they had no respect for me, no respect for Max. I'd spent years swallowing my pride, biting my tongue, hoping that somehow, things would change. But they hadn't. The people I had trusted, the people I had built a life with, had turned their backs on me and my son without a second thought. And now, here we were, just the two of us starting over. It should have felt liberating, but it didn't. Not yet. One afternoon, while Max was building a sandcastle near the shore, I sat on a beach chair a few feet away, watching him carefully. The sun was warm, the sky a clear, endless blue. Families strolled along the shoreline, kids laughing as they splashed in the shallow waves. It was the kind of scene that should have felt idyllic, almost perfect. But my chest was still tight with attention. I couldn't quite shake. I had my phone in my pocket, and I hadn't looked at it all day. I knew there'd be messages waiting, but I couldn't bring myself to open them. The thought of seeing Daphne's name on the screen, of reading whatever cold, manipulative words she'd written, made my stomach turn. She'd made her choice, just like Sylvia had. They didn't care about Max, not really, not the way they should have. And I wasn't about to let them worm their way back into our lives. Max looked up from his sandcastle, his cheeks flushed from the sun. "Dad! Look what I made!" he called out, waving his arms excitedly. I smiled, forcing the heaviness in my chest to the back of my mind as I walked over to him. "That's awesome, buddy," I said, crouching down to get a closer look. He'd built a tall tower in the center, with smaller walls surrounding it, and he was already busy adding more details, his hands covered in wet sand. His enthusiasm was contagious. For a few minutes, I was able to focus on him, just him, and not the mess we'd left behind. "Can we stay out here until it gets dark?" he asked, looking up at me with those big brown eyes. I chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Sure thing, buddy. As long as you want." He grinned, going back to his sandcastle, and I sat down beside him, letting the sun warm my back. It was moments like these that made everything worth it. Max was happy, Max was safe, and that was all I cared about. But as the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, my thoughts turned darker again. I knew this peace couldn't last forever. Daphne wouldn't just let us go. She'd made that clear. I didn't know what her next move would be, but I knew it was coming. That cold, calculating look she'd given me at the airport haunted me, and I knew better than to think she'd just walk away. She wasn't the type to give up control, not of me, and certainly not of Max. I just didn't know what she'd try first. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, and this time, I couldn't ignore it. I pulled it out, squinting at the screen in the fading light. Sure enough, it was her. I sighed, my thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before swiping to open the message. Her words were short and to the point, but they still cut deep. You can't run forever. Max belongs with his family. Family. As if she understood what that word meant. As if she hadn't just abandoned him at the airport, like he was some piece of luggage that didn't fit into their plans. My hand tightened around the phone, my jaw clenched. I wanted to throw it into the ocean, to let the waves take it far away so I'd never have to read another word from her. But that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I stood up, sliding the phone back into my pocket. Come on, Max, I said, my voice steady. Let's get some dinner. He looked up from his sandcastle, his face lighting up at the mention of food. Pizza? He asked, and I smiled. Sure, pizza it is. He grabbed his dinosaur and scrambled to his feet, his excitement washing away the tension in my chest, if only for a little while. We walked back to the motel as the last rays of sunlight faded into dusk. The neon sign out front buzzed faintly, casting a faint glow over the parking lot. Max was already listing all the toppings he wanted on his pizza. His voice animated as he clutched my hand. I nodded along, letting him carry the conversation. I needed that his energy, his joy to remind me of what I was fighting for. Inside the motel room, I ordered the pizza while Max turned on the TV. A cartoon played softly in the background as I leaned against the counter, staring at my phone on the table. I could feel the weight of it, as if it were daring me to pick it up again, to read the other messages I knew were waiting. But I didn't. I couldn't let her get under my skin, not now. I had to stay focused. I had to keep moving forward. For Max. When the pizza arrived, we sat cross-legged on the bed, the box between us, and dug in. Max chatted happily about his sandcastle, about the shells he'd found on the beach, about the seagull that had tried to steal his crackers. I listened, laughing at his stories, letting his voice fill the room. It felt normal, comfortable, almost like the life we'd left behind never existed. But I knew better. I knew that as much as I wanted to pretend we'd left all of it behind, it was still there, waiting. Daphne's messages, Sylvia's disdain, the years of manipulation and control, they weren't going to disappear just because I'd driven 1,000 miles away. They'd follow me. They'd try to pull me back. But as I looked at Max, his face bright with excitement as he told me about his plans for tomorrow, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let them. I'd fight with everything I had to keep him safe. Because that's what a father does. That's what love does. And no one, not Daphne, not Sylvia, not anyone was going to take that away from us. Back in the motel room, with Max asleep and the TV off, the silence was deafening. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone like it was some kind of loaded weapon. I hadn't opened any more of Daphne's messages since that first one. But the notifications were still there, little red numbers taunting me every time I unlocked the screen. The worst part wasn't even what she'd said, it was knowing she wasn't going to stop. She was like a hunter who'd caught the scent of her prey. She thought she could outlast me, wear me down until I had no choice but to give in. And the truth was, I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold out. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could hear it whistling around the corners of the building, rattling the windows. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon was finally here, and it felt fitting somehow, like the weather was matching my mood. I glanced over at Max, curled up on the bed, his little body barely taking up half the mattress. His dinosaur was tucked under his arm, its fabric tail sticking out from the covers. He looked so peaceful, so completely unaware of the storm swirling just beyond these walls. I envied him. I envied that he could sleep through all of this, that he didn't have to sit up late into the night, wondering what move Daphne would make next, or how I was supposed to counter it. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to clear my thoughts. For a moment, I considered deleting her messages without reading them, just wiping them all away, so I wouldn't have to see her name pop up on my screen again. But that would only give her more power. If I didn't know what she was saying, I couldn't prepare myself for whatever stunt she might try next. And if she really wanted to drag me back into her world, into that cold, suffocating grip she'd held on me for years, I needed to stay one step ahead. I unlocked my phone and stared at the messages. There were 4 unread texts now, all from her. My thumb hovered over the screen, and I hesitated for just a second before tapping on the first one. Gideon, this is getting ridiculous. You can't keep ignoring me. We need to talk about Max. My jaw tightened. Her concern for Max was laughable. She didn't care about him. If she did, she never would have left him behind. I swiped to the next message. You know you're being selfish, right? This isn't just about you. Max deserves his family. He deserves stability. You're just running away from your responsibilities. My blood boiled at her audacity. Running away? I was the one keeping Max safe, the one giving him a real chance at happiness. She and Sylvia were the ones who'd abandoned him, who'd made it clear he wasn't a priority. And now she had the nerve to accuse me of being selfish? I clenched my teeth and read the next message. Fine. If you won't come back, I'll have no choice but to take this to court. You'll lose, Gideon. You'll lose, and Max will end up where he belongs with me. My chest tightened. There it was, the threat I'd been waiting for. I'd known it was coming, but seeing it spelled out like that still felt like a punch to the gut. She was threatening to take Max away from me, to drag us both back into her toxic orbit. I could practically hear her voice as I read her words, cold and calculated, dripping with the kind of false confidence she'd always used to get her way. I didn't open the 4th message. I couldn't. My hands were shaking, and I felt a lump rising in my throat. I tossed the phone onto the nightstand and leaned back against the headboard, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I wanted to shout, to hit something, to lash out at the injustice of it all. But I couldn't. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Instead, I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, on the sound of the wind outside, on the steady rhythm of Max's breathing as he slept. Slowly, the tightness in my chest began to ease, and my thoughts started to clear. I knew I couldn't let her get to me. I couldn't let her threats paralyze me. She might think she had all the power, but she didn't know me as well as she thought. She didn't know what I was willing to do to protect my son. I glanced over at Max again, my resolve hardening. He was all that mattered now. Keeping him safe, keeping him happy, that was my only priority. Daphne could threaten me all she wanted, but I wasn't going to let her or anyone else tear him away from me. I'd fight her. I'd fight her in court, in the media, wherever I had to. I'd stand up to her and Sylvia both, and I wouldn't back down. As the storm outside raged on, I found myself feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that we could build a life together. Just the two of us. Hope that I could show Max what it meant to have a parent who truly cared, who put him first. Hope that one day, he'd look back on this time not as a moment of loss, but as the moment when everything changed for the better. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't afraid of Daphne anymore. I wasn't the same man I'd been before. I was stronger now. And no matter how hard she tried to break me, I wouldn't let her win. Because this wasn't just about me, it was about Max. It was about giving him the life he deserved. And that was a fight I would never, ever lose. I don't think I slept much after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her messages flashing across my mind. Her words digging into me like thorns. I'd gotten up at least 3 times to check on Max, each time reassured by the soft rise and fall of his chest, his stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. But I couldn't stop my own mind from racing. Every scenario played out in vivid detail: the arguments, the courtrooms, the way Daphne would twist the truth until it didn't even resemble the life we'd lived. By the time the first pale streaks of morning light crept through the curtains, I felt like I'd run a marathon. But I was far from finished. Max woke up chipper as ever, bouncing out of bed and asking what we were doing that day. I wanted to keep things normal for him, keep the routine simple and steady. So I told him we'd have breakfast at that diner he liked and maybe hit the beach again. He lit up at the idea, and for a moment, his excitement was enough to pull me out of my head. I watched him scarf down his cereal and chatter about the shells he'd collected. And I made myself smile. For him, I had to keep it together. The diner was just waking up when we got there, the familiar smell of bacon and coffee hanging in the air. Max ordered his usual pancakes, drowning them in syrup as I nursed a cup of coffee that felt like it was the only thing keeping me upright. The waitress, a sweet woman who always remembered Max's name, asked how we were doing. I just nodded, not trusting myself to say much. Max did the talking, filling the silence with his stories about the waves and the sand, and how many starfish he thought we'd find that afternoon. I leaned back in the booth, letting his words wash over me, trying to soak in his innocence. It was a reminder of why I was fighting so hard, why I had to keep going. After breakfast, we made our way to the beach again. Max ran ahead, kicking off his shoes. The moment his feet hit the sand, I followed more slowly, my thoughts still heavy despite the bright sun and clear sky. The beach was already dotted with families, kids splashing in the waves, parents lounging under umbrellas. I found a spot near the water, close enough to keep an eye on Max as he darted in and out of the surf. I spread out a towel and sat down, the ocean breeze cool against my face. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that should have been perfect, but my mind wouldn't let me enjoy it. I kept looking at my phone, at the messages I still hadn't answered. She was probably waiting for me to break, to snap back with something she could use against me. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I had to be smarter than that. Every time I thought about her dragging me into court, about her trying to paint me as the bad guy, it made my blood boil. She didn't deserve that power. Not after what she'd done. Max's laughter brought me back. He was chasing a seagull now, his arms outstretched, his face lit up with pure joy. I watched him, my heart swelling despite the weight I was carrying. Seeing him like that, so free, so completely in the moment, gave me a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in days. I knew I couldn't let anything, or anyone, take that away from him. Not Daphne, not her threats, not her games. Max deserved to be happy, and I'd make sure he was. I stood up and walked down to the water's edge, letting the waves lap at my feet. The cool rush of the tide helped clear my head, if only for a moment. I turned my phone over in my hand, the screen black, the messages waiting. I'd been carrying it around like a weight, letting it dictate my thoughts and emotions. But as I stood there, the ocean stretching out endlessly before me, I realized I had a choice. I didn't have to let her words control me. I didn't have to let her pull me back into that dark, suffocating place. I pocketed the phone and walked back to Max. "Hey, buddy," I called out. "What do you think about building the biggest sandcastle on the beach today?" His eyes lit up, and he ran over, already talking about towers and moats, and how he'd need my help to dig the deepest trench. I smiled, really smiled, for the first time that day. We spent hours in the sand, working side by side, until the castle was towering and intricate. People passing by stopped to admire it, and Max beamed with pride. As the sun started to dip toward the horizon, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just fighting against Daphne anymore. I was fighting for Max. For his happiness. For his future. For his right to grow up without the weight of their dysfunction dragging him down. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew I hadn't seen the last of her threats. But as I sat there on the beach, the waves rolling in, and Max laughing beside me, I knew I was strong enough to handle it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were going to be okay. I sat in the car, parked just down the street from the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me steady. The early morning sun glared through the windshield, making the day feel even hotter than it actually was. My tie felt too tight, my collar stiff against my neck, but I wasn't about to loosen it. I had to look like I had everything together, even if I didn't feel that way inside. Max was at a friend's house for the day, safe and out of earshot of whatever was about to go down, and that was the only thing keeping me grounded. The folder on the passenger seat contained every piece of evidence I could gather: receipts, emails, documents from the past few years that painted the picture Daphne wanted to erase. I'd spent hours combing through every detail, double-checking every fact. It had taken everything I had to stay focused, to not let my emotions overwhelm me. This wasn't about revenge or anger anymore. This was about protecting Max. About showing the judge that he deserved to stay with me. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 15 minutes until the hearing. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I knew Daphne would be there, sitting at that long wooden table with her high-powered lawyer, dressed to the nines, and ready to tell whatever story she thought would win her the case. I could picture her perfectly, calm, collected, flashing that fake smile of hers when she made eye contact with the judge. She'd probably brought her mother too, just for the added intimidation factor. The two of them together were like a well-oiled machine. and they'd spent years honing their act. But I wasn't the same man I was back then. I wasn't the guy who sat quietly while they called the shots. When I finally stepped into the courtroom, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The walls were painted that dull beige color that every courthouse seemed to have, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Daphne was already there, seated at her table, her attorney leaning in close as they whispered back and forth. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes narrowing slightly before she gave me that familiar, condescending smile. I didn't return it. I just straightened my tie and took my seat, opening the folder in front of me as though I hadn't noticed her at all. The judge entered, and we all stood. He was a man in his 60s, with a stern face and a gravelly voice that filled the room. "Let's get started," he said, and just like that, the hearing began. Daphne's lawyer went first, launching into a polished opening statement about stability and family, and how Max belonged with his mother. He spoke with confidence, using words like unfit and erratic to describe me, spinning a narrative that made my stomach turn. Daphne sat there, nodding slightly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It was all so rehearsed, so calculated. And for a moment, I felt a pang of doubt. What if the judge believed them? What if their carefully crafted story was enough to undo everything I'd fought for? But then it was my turn. I stood, smoothing out my jacket, and looked directly at the judge. I spoke plainly, calmly, letting the truth carry the weight it needed. I talked about the years of neglect, the way Daphne had walked out on us, the way Sylvia had undermined me at every turn. I laid out every piece of evidence, every receipt and email, showing that Max's well-being had always been my top priority. I talked about the nights I stayed up late helping him with homework, the mornings I drove him to school, the afternoons we spent together at the park. I painted a picture of a life Daphne had never been a part of, a life she couldn't understand because she'd never been there. As I spoke, I glanced over at her table. Daphne was still smiling, but there was a tightness in her jaw, a slight fidget in her hands. She wasn't as composed as she wanted everyone to think. I could feel the shift in the room, a subtle change in the energy. The judge leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the documents I'd provided. My words were landing, and Daphne knew it. When it came time for her to speak, her voice was smooth, almost soothing, as she talked about how much she loved Max and how she just wanted what was best for him. She said all the right things, her tone perfectly modulated, her words carefully chosen, but they rang hollow. I could see it in the judge's eyes. He wasn't buying it. Not entirely, at least. The final arguments came and went, and then it was over. The judge said he needed time to review everything, and the hearing was adjourned. Daphne stood, gathering her things with that same practiced grace she always had. But I caught the quick glance she shot my way before she left the room. It wasn't the look of someone who was confident in her victory. It was the look of someone who knew the truth might finally catch up to her. I stayed in my seat for a few moments after everyone else had gone, staring down at the empty folder in front of me. The adrenaline that had kept me going through the hearing was starting to wear off, leaving me with a mix of exhaustion and uncertainty. I knew I'd done everything I could, that I'd presented my case as clearly and honestly as possible. But the waiting, that was the hard part. Not knowing how it would all turn out, not knowing if the truth would be enough. By the time I walked out of the courthouse, the sun was high in the sky, the air hot and heavy. I loosened my tie, finally letting myself breathe. Max was waiting for me back at the friend's house, completely unaware of the storm I'd just weathered. That was the one silver lining in all of this. He didn't have to see it, didn't have to feel the tension, or hear the accusations. He could just be a kid for a little while longer, and I'd take whatever burden I had to if it meant protecting that. As I got into the car, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, older than I had a few weeks ago. But there was a steadiness in my eyes that hadn't been there before. I might not have known what the judge's decision would be, but I knew I'd done the right thing. I knew I'd fought for my son with everything I had. And no matter what happened next, I wouldn't stop fighting. Because Max was worth it. The day I got the call, I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the yard where Max had been playing just a few hours before. It was one of those rare moments when the house was quiet, and I finally had a chance to sit and think. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was before I even picked it up. My stomach tightened as I hit accept and pressed the phone to my ear. "Mr. Wolf?" the voice on the other end said. "This is Judge Hanson's clerk. We have a decision." My heart stopped. For a split second, I thought about not listening, just hanging up, and pretending the call never happened. But that wasn't an option. I had fought too hard, spent too many sleepless nights preparing for this moment. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. "I'm listening," I said, my voice steady. There was a pause, just long enough for my pulse to pick up speed, and then the clerk read out the judgment. Max would remain with me. I wasn't just relieved, I was completely overwhelmed. It felt like I could finally breathe again. My hands shook as I thanked the clerk and hung up the phone. The reality of it settled over me slowly, like the weight of all the stress and fear I'd been carrying was finally lifting. I'd won. I'd actually won. Max came running into the kitchen a few minutes later, his face lit up with excitement. "What's for dinner, Dad?" he asked, completely unaware of the massive shift that had just happened. I ruffled his hair and smiled, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever you want, buddy," I said, and his grin got even wider. He started listing off options: pizza, burgers, spaghetti, and I just nodded along, my mind still spinning. I thought back to the hearing, to the way Daphne's lawyer had painted me as some kind of reckless, irresponsible father. I remembered the way Daphne had sat there, all polished and calm, like she'd already won. But I'd stood my ground. I'd told the truth. And the judge had seen through her. For once, the system had worked in my favor. I'd fought for Max, for our life together, and I'd come out on the other side. As I made dinner that night, Max kept chatting about his day, his new favorite show, the game he'd been playing in the yard, the funny thing his teacher said in class. His voice was full of excitement, and I found myself laughing along, finally able to relax. It wasn't just the weight of the court case that was gone. It was the fear. The fear that Daphne would find a way to take him from me. That fear had been my constant companion, always lurking in the back of my mind. But now, for the first time, it was gone. After Max went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the phone on the counter. There was still a part of me that expected it to buzz, for Daphne to call with some new threat, some new way to turn the tables. But it stayed silent. I let out a long breath, the kind you don't realize you're holding until you finally let it go. I'd done it. I'd kept Max safe. I'd fought for him, for us, and I'd won. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the messages I hadn't looked at since the hearing. There were a few from friends, a few from family, all asking how it went. I typed out quick replies, keeping it simple. "We won. Max stays with me." As I hit send on each message, I felt a little more of that tension leave my body. The fight was over, at least for now. That night, as I lay in bed, I let myself imagine the future. A future where Max and I didn't have to look over our shoulders, where we could just live. I thought about the things we could do, the trips we could take, the life we could build. It felt like the first time in a long time that I'd allowed myself to hope. The storm had passed. And while I knew there might be other challenges ahead, I also knew I was ready for them. Max was safe. That was all that mattered. I closed my eyes and fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep I'd had in years. After the ruling, it felt like the house itself had shifted. The air was lighter, as if the tension that had been pulling at the walls for so long had finally broken. Max came bounding down the stairs the next morning with his usual energy, and I found myself smiling in a way that wasn't forced. He wasn't aware of what had happened in that courtroom, at least, not entirely, but I could see in his face that he felt the difference. He no longer looked at me with that half-formed question, that quiet worry that I might not always be there. He knew now, even if he couldn't quite put it into words, that we were going to be okay. We spent the morning doing normal things, things that had felt impossible just a few weeks before. We went to the park, tossed a baseball around, and stopped by the diner for lunch. Max insisted on pancakes again, and the waitress smiled knowingly when I gave in. I sat there with my coffee, watching him draw little shapes in the syrup with his fork, and I realized that this was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not the court ruling itself, not the chance to prove Daphne wrong, but this, the ordinary, quiet happiness of just being together. It wasn't about winning. It was about living. When we got home that afternoon, the house was warm with sunlight. Max disappeared into his room to work on a Lego project he'd been obsessing over, and I took a moment to sit in the living room, staring out the window at the trees in the yard. The sound of him humming to himself floated down the hall, and for the first time in what felt like years, I let myself just sit. Not think, not plan, not worry. Just sit. The phone rang around 3 p.m., jolting me out of my thoughts. I picked it up, expecting another congratulations from a family member or a friend. Instead, it was Daphne. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity, or maybe something else, got the better of me. I braced myself, my fingers tightening around the phone as I pressed it to my ear. "Gideon," she said. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. I just wanted to say, "Congratulations." I frowned, not trusting her sudden change in tone. "Congratulations?" I echoed, the word tasting strange in my mouth. "Yes," she replied, her voice smooth as silk. "You fought for what you wanted, and you got it. I can respect that." I didn't know what to say to that. Daphne had never been the type to hand out respect, at least. Not without some kind of catch. I waited, expecting the other shoe to drop, and sure enough, it did. "But you should know," she continued, her voice sharpening slightly, "this isn't over." There it was. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "What do you mean, Daphne?" "I mean," she said, her words deliberate, "that you may have won this battle, but the war isn't over. I'll always be Max's mother, and I'm not going to just disappear. Don't think for a second that you can shut me out forever." I closed my eyes, feeling a flash of anger rise in my chest. I'd fought so hard to keep Max safe, to give him a stable, happy life, and here she was, already scheming to find a way back in. But I couldn't let her bait me. Not now. I took a slow, steady breath before responding. "Daphne," the first said, my voice even, "Max is happy. He's thriving. I don't need to shut you out, you've done that all on your own." There was a pause on the line, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. But then she spoke again, her voice icy. "We'll see how long that happiness lasts." I didn't bother responding. I just ended the call, and set the phone down on the coffee table, my hands trembling slightly. I wasn't afraid of her, not anymore. But the idea that she might keep pushing, keep trying to worm her way back in, made my stomach tighten. I wasn't naive enough to think that this was truly the end of her interference. But I also knew that I wasn't the same man I'd been before. I wouldn't let her shake me. I wouldn't let her threaten the life Max and I had started to rebuild. Later that evening, as I tucked Max into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. "Dad," he said softly, "you'll always be here, right?" I nodded, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Always," I whispered, my voice steady. "No matter what." He smiled, his eyelids already drooping with sleep, and I sat there for a moment longer, watching him drift off. As I closed his bedroom door, I felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over me. I'd made a promise, not just to the court or to myself, but to Max. A promise to be there for him, to protect him, to give him the kind of childhood he deserved. And I wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in the way of that. The days that followed were calm, almost peaceful. I made it a point to be fully present in Max's life, to savor the little moments that had once seemed so ordinary. We played catch in the yard, baked cookies in the kitchen, and watched his favorite movies together on the couch. It wasn't some grand, dramatic victory parade. It was just life, simple, genuine, and full of love. And that, I realized, was the true victory. Daphne's threats lingered in the back of my mind, but I didn't let them consume me. I focused on what mattered, Max's laughter, his excitement when he showed me his latest Lego creation, the way he hugged me tightly every morning before school. I knew there would be challenges ahead, that Daphne might try something else down the line, but I also knew that I was stronger than I'd ever been. I had the truth on my side. I had Max's happiness and well-being as my guiding star. And that was all I needed. One afternoon, as Max and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me and said, "Dad, this is the best summer ever." I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. "Yeah, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "It really is." And in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, we'd be okay. We had each other. We had a home filled with love and laughter. And that was something no one could take away from us. I'd faced the storm, stood my ground, and come out stronger on the other side. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet, steady certainty take root inside me. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. I took a stand, but the story doesn't end here. The choices I made, well, let's just say they came at a cost. But was it worth it? What happened next was beyond anything I could have imagined, and I'm still feeling the ripple effects. Let me know, would you have done the same thing in my shoes? Everyone deserves a fair chance to protect their family, regardless of the obstacles. My fight showed me that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's necessary. In our country, where justice often seems out of reach, we must remind ourselves that persistence, truth, and love will carry us forward. Don't let fear or manipulation hold you back. Push forward, and show those around you, neighbors, friends, even strangers, that courage and integrity still matter. This isn't just about me, it's about building a stronger, fairer community for all of us.